Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sam Dolce, and I'm an attorney at Milestone. Milestone is a settlement administration company that specializes in settlement planning as well as attorney fee deferral. And today I'm so very excited to invite our amazing guest, Dr. Laura Mcguire, who I like to consider a personal friend, as well as just being one of the leaders in the field of trauma-informed care nationally. She's the director of the Center for Equity and Inclusion. Did I get that right?
The National Center for Equity and
National
Agency.
Center for Equity and Inclusion. I knew I was going to mess something up. Thank you. And it really has helped our company. And I know law firms across the country, as well as insurance companies across the country, be able to better serve their constituents, their clients. And so what we're going to talk about today is best practices, especially in the legal space. And I'll let Laura introduce herself as well, because Dr. Mcguire is the expert.
Well, thank you, Sam, so much for having me back on. And we were just talking before we went live about how many years we've been having these conversations, how they've evolved. It's really been incredible to witness. So my name is Dr. Laura Mcguire. My pronouns are they and she. I run the National Center for Equity and Agency, and we are a consulting practice that is kind of unique. We're all social scientists. We all identify as scholars in that space and also as survivors. So we very much bring our lived experience with what data and research is backing up to have transformational conversations, particularly in spaces like you said, like legal, insurance, education, military groups, etc., where sometimes this is the first time that we're really going in depth into what trauma-informed care looks like and how it benefits all parties.
So just before we begin and get into everything, I want everyone to start with a baseline. So for people who may not be familiar, can you give a very brief overview? I know it's like a large and complicated topic, but like what is trauma-informed care? And then more specifically in the legal sphere, like what does that mean, right?
Yeah, exactly. So tons of definitions out there for what this is. When I do my programs, this is how I define it. It's three main things. Number one, it's understanding the depth and then the breadth of trauma in the world around us. So really getting an understanding of things that you might not think of as trauma or traumatic and what that looks like and how that impacts people. Secondly, it's switching the paradigm in your mind to see everyone as a survivor, right? Not needing someone to disclose that they've been through trauma in order for them to get that kind of response and support. And then last but not least, it's again, another kind of shift in the framework of how we think, in going from saying, you know, why are people like this? Why are they so aggressive? Or why do they seem not to be able to handle certain things? Or why are their memories so scattered? Instead of saying why, we switch to what. I wonder what happened. I wonder how I can support them. I wonder what's going on. And even if I'm not gonna ask them that, I'm still gonna have that kind of curious nature in me to want to figure out how I can be somebody who's helping them to heal and get the results that they want. And then in the legal space, you know, this really came about from a couple of years of attorneys reaching out and saying, love what you're doing. I, you know, primarily had done this with education, higher ed, and the military. They're like, could you bring this into legal spaces? Or like, is there anything on that? And so many of them, you know, didn't get Psych 101 in college or in law school. So there's a lot of questions about, again, people's behaviors and how to support them and how to support yourself, because this is really hard work. And so that's where we developed some workshops, and then that led to our certification. And we now have the country's first trauma-informed certification for both legal professionals and insurance professionals.
Amazing. It's amazing. So there's a lot of things that are done right in the space. I want to kind of start though by talking about what's not necessarily always done right. So I remember as a young attorney being in a law office, there was something called problem clients, and soon became very aware to me that there weren't really problem clients, just not really always people who knew how to navigate those situations. So what's some things that you see happening in law firms that you work with that are areas where they can improve?
Yeah. So like you said, lots of good happening. I think to start off, one thing is there's been more kind of general foundational awareness that trauma-informed care is a thing, that trauma exists, and to be maybe more emotionally intelligent in our approach to working with people. So that's great. Where that can sometimes have like this great intention and maybe not the impact that we want is where, again, people kind of think that's where it stops. Like, I'll be more sensitive, I'll pause more and let someone, fill in the quiet space. And they're like, so that's it, checking the box on trauma-informed care. And so again, that's why we really want people to have more of an in-depth education that's customized to their industry. So some of the things that come up a lot in legal spaces are communication, right? So particularly with clients, they don't know what the options are. They don't know how forms work. They don't know how updates in their case are really going to impact them or not, right? So they imagine and they go down all these routes of what if and worst case scenarios. They don't know what they can be proactive about and feel empowered in kind of navigating this ship that is their situation, their case. And so helping attorneys to understand how to help people cognitively, emotionally. And then in communication is also how to communicate in written text, so email, even text message. A lot of attorneys text their clients. And again, that's a place where people can really be re-traumatized and feel silenced and feel shut down, or like, oh, they're too busy for me. I don't know if I can reach out because maybe I can't afford to text them because it's so expensive, on and on, right? So having real clarity, and that comes down to consent, a lot of open, transparent information, making sure that we're checking in with people, making sure that we are providing a space where they really can relax and breathe and co-regulate with us. I think sometimes people are like, well, I'm not a therapist, I can't do all of that, but it's not being a therapist, right? It's really that you in your role and having those specific boundaries so that you can maintain that and do what you do really well. Having that same kind of approach of, again, providing that kind of response that allows the brain to really relax and open up and memories to come in clearer and outcomes to be better. And that leads to more referrals and clients who want to continue to work with you, et cetera.
So I've seen a lot of things in my years in the space. And one of the things I saw a law firm once do was they provided a flyer that was like the life of a case, right? Like filing the complaint, doing the discovery, just like really not even a law school level thing, not even a pre-law, just really basic. Like this is what's going to happen, and these are the times when we're going to be calling upon you, right?
Yep.
Have you seen other things that are done like that on more of like a systemic level? Like it's not knowing what to say at the right times, but more so how to put the systems in place within the firm.
Yes, absolutely. And I think flow charts like what you're mentioning are a huge starting point, like really actually a cornerstone that needs to stay in place throughout all aspects of the process in whatever area of law you practice, right? Is again, giving people who are coming in with all different education levels, English might be their second language, etc., might have a lot of different barriers in place to understanding what does this look like? What are my options? Yeah, when am I going to hear from you? When do you need to hear from me? Am I going to be able to get support if I'm stuck on something, I don't understand something? So having that in place, having that readily available so people don't have to try to dig to get that information. And I think the other big thing that we're seeing more and more be really impactful is, again, having everybody from the person who answers the phone to, other paralegals, all attorneys involved in the case, have at least foundational information to be working from, right? Because sometimes they'll be like, oh yeah, we'll get this subset of people certified or trained. And then they're not even getting to that point of meeting them because the person who's picking up the phone has good intentions, but is, being very short with them or abrasive, and they don't mean that, but the person doesn't call back, right? Or they don't keep their appointment. So making sure that it's congruent across the board.
Yeah, I mean, you already know this. We do our company-wide trainings with you, obviously, and we do everyone in the company, right? Like everyone. And a lot of time too, it's not only about being trauma informed with working with outside clients, but working with one another. That's something that we've learned, and as you know, part of our directorship, like I've realized the positive impacts of that. So that was really well said. Trauma informed care. I mean, it's a big topic. It's all in the news and everything. The past couple of years, especially, I feel like people are starting to listen finally. But how has that idea sort of evolved over the years, and how have you seen it sort of evolve in the legal space specifically?
Yeah, great question.
Thanks.
So, looking at the history of this topic, it's pretty new. It's a pretty new topic in the world. I'll often say to people, if you were born in 1980 or before, the term PTSD in and of itself, which is now common vernacular, but that phrase, that acronym for post-traumatic stress disorder, didn't exist before the 1980s, right? That's really, really recent. And so trauma-informed care too, things like the ACE studies, comes out mid to late 90s. We start seeing then therapists, social workers, educators start getting on board with this, some medical areas as well of saying, yeah, this directly feeds into inequities. We need to do something about it. What we also see though is, again, a lot of different spaces, different fields that do work directly with people experiencing trauma and then deal with secondary trauma because of the work that they're exposed to, not necessarily having this kind of education. Or like I mentioned previously, it's a very broad overview of like, hey, this impacts people's brains and bodies, and be aware of that, be emotionally intelligent, but not here's how that would directly apply to you, or intersecting it with things like unconscious bias. Unconscious bias and inclusion is a huge part of trauma-informed care that often gets overlooked. And so we're seeing that continue and evolve. And I think one of the things now that we've done a number of trainings with the insurance industry and with legal firms and individuals is seeing how many light bulbs go off where people are like, this is exactly that kind of piece of the puzzle that was missing, right? I wanted to be there for people, and I wanted to know the right thing to say, and I wanted to understand how my body language impacted that, or how to keep them calm during a really contentious hearing. But I didn't know, right? I could just kind of guess, maybe Google, here's some things in passing. So giving people those actionable tools is really where this is going. And, seeing how those connections are made is really what's going to change things systemically.
Really well said. You mentioned something that I kind of want to pick up on. How do inclusion and intersectionality directly relate to trauma-informed care?
Yeah. So, oh my goodness, so many things, right? Because when we talk about trauma and how, especially childhood experiences or chronic acute trauma, directly impacts the way that an individual is going to interact with the world in general, right? It's going to impact how they interact with people at work, at home, in their community, etc. So if we want to build inclusive environments, right? Another hot topic, oh yeah, diversity and inclusion, we're all for it. Okay, well, have you talked about how trauma and people coming into those spaces with trauma or currently processing new traumatic experiences, how you're going to support them, how you're going to respond to that, how they're not going to be further victimized and punished because, of having to deal with that kind of chronic stressors, right? And then the other part of it is whenever we talk about any of the other areas of marginalization or oppression, what does that always come with? Trauma, right? You can't face erasure. You can't face, again, systemic structural inequality and not experience trauma from that. And then there's epigenetic trauma, the reality that we're also carrying this down from our ancestors and what they've experienced. And as communities, when something happens to one individual in our community, we are going to experience that on a secondary level as well. And so we're trying to get people to make that connection and say, yeah, these are not separate things. These are not things that are kind of siloed topics. These are things we need to be talking about coherently and together.
So 2 responses ago, and sorry if I sound like a lawyer now, 2 responses ago, you said, I'm just kidding. But 2 responses ago, you mentioned restorative practices. And I work a lot around settlement. And so I always think about how restorative practices can take place during a mediation or during a conclusion of a case. And how does that sort of interact with a trauma-informed environment, right?
Yeah. So much so. Thank you for bringing that up. So in my previous life, when I worked particularly in higher ed and then for the military, working in sexual misconduct prevention and response, I started a lot of programs that involved restorative practices. And that came from doing a lot of research, going to conferences at the UN, listening to what people were doing globally around these topics, and how restorative practices could be applied to really support victims and to create better longitudinal outcomes. And so I think it's integral to trauma-informed care because, like you're talking about with settlements and mediation, this kind of falls into the purview of what is the umbrella term of informal resolutions, right? That, yes, money is really, really important and we don't want to discount that at all. But oftentimes people feel like, well, you know, this is good, but I don't really feel like this was healing. I don't feel like there was a cathartic piece to this. Therapeutic jurisprudence, right, is another concept that falls into this space of, was I heard? Is anything going to change from this outcome? Are the people who caused harm or allowed it to go on, are they going to make those same thing connections, right, between their behavior and what the future needs to look like so that this isn't a pattern that repeats? And so now, you know, I'm taking the work that I did with higher ed professionals and attorneys, and again, in the military as well, and continuing that work, but then also bringing it in directly to mediation spaces. So doing trauma-informed mediation advisement, working with mediators and attorneys and saying, okay, how do we create an environment where, again, people are really going to be heard, where they're going to feel like this is so much more beneficial than that slap on the wrist and a check, that things are going to be put in place so that a new norm is created and that there aren't going to be further victims in this organization, this school, this environment.
Really well said. I mean, I've worked in a different context at times where I'll volunteer on employment cases every once in a while, and a lot of the times we'll have the plaintiffs won't be really interested in the dollar amount. They'll be interested in the outcome for the future of the establishment and what it'll mean to their coworkers, right? And so we've seen a lot of settlements kind of, you know, from a dollar standpoint weren't significant, but from an ask on the institution, were quite significant, right? Like the way that they changed their policies moving forward were night and day, right? And that's really what the client wanted. It's weird though, because as a plaintiff's attorney, the best math you're able to do is dividing by 1/3. So it's a battle that we have in our own space, right? Something that I think that we constantly need to be reevaluating. One question that I kind of have that sort of stems from this, right, is do you notice something different working with lawyers? Because I know you've worked in a lot of different spaces. And so now working with lawyers and law firms for the past several years, is there something different about us, or is it all sort of the same?
Well, you know, I think every industry has norms that are created, right? That emerge from the kind of exposure, the kind of conversations, the kinds of education that people have in general, right? And everyone's an individual, but I think that we can kind of say, yeah, there are things that commonly come up. I think more than not, I meet a lot of attorneys that, again, are passionate about this and aren't completely sure that they don't know what they don't know, right? They're like, there's probably things I'm missing here, but I'm not sure if there is, or I'm not sure what that would look like. Can you help us understand? I think the other really big challenge is so many times people have gotten again, training, education, professional development, their, JD experience in school, where they were taught the opposite of trauma-informed care, right? We hear people say, I was always taught that if someone gets confused with their story, or if they make a mistake, or if they try to fill in information because they're scared, and then we can find an issue with their credibility and we can tear the whole thing apart, right? And that's like my job, or that's what I'm supposed to do, or I'm supposed to tell my client exactly what to do, and it shouldn't be up to them because they don't know what they're doing, and I'm the expert. And so a lot of it's unlearning, a lot of it's deprogramming, right? And it's helping people to see, okay, where do those messages come from? Again, a lot of it's like good intentions or just historical stuff that's left over that was never based on research, or was never based on any kind of data-driven best practice. And so helping people to rethink things and come with that different approach, and then see, once again, the real transformative benefits of that. Bringing in these different practices, whether it's in a mediation room, or it's training people when they go out there and they're having a first meeting with a potential client, having them come back and say, that was totally different, that was so much better, but again, I wasn't sure what was missing. I thought I was doing my job and doing it well, but really not understanding the psychosocial components was holding me back.
I mean, I can speak to that personally, right? I mean, I think we've always been a great settlement planning company, but then I think about 3 or 4 years ago, we really doubled down on trauma informed as an institution, right? And so Bridie Farrell built our whole settlement planning practice for working with specifically survivors, but people who've been through all sorts of trauma, and then working with you directly with trainings. And then to me, almost most importantly, is the retrainings, right? So it's giving everybody on the staff that baseline. But these things, they're not static topics, right? They're not static issues. They're ever evolving, as we've kind of highlighted earlier. So we only take 30 minutes of people's time, and I want to provide at least 5 minutes for questions. So I just have one final question really quickly. So if there's one takeaway, just one, you hope viewers were to walk away from this webinar with, what would that be?
So sometimes I'll tell people a way to kind of metaphorically look at trauma-informed care is whether we keep it on a shelf in a box, or whether it's something that we put on when we're presenting ourselves to the world every day. And so often with any of these topics, right, we kind of leave them on a shelf. We're like, yeah, I'll take that down when it's absolutely necessary and everything else has failed. Versus, again, like I would, put on my watch every day. I'm going to put on trauma-informed care every single day. And I don't have to be at work or facing a client to provide it. I'm going to give it to my colleague who's having a hard time. I'm going to give it in the grace I provide to, even the other counsel or the judge. I'm going to make sure that when I'm walking around my community, that the way I'm talking to the person serving my food or the person checking me out at the grocery store is trauma-informed in its approach, because we have to walk the talk. It cannot be something that people say, yeah, they turn it on when it's going to benefit them, and then they turn it off because it's not part of who they are. So I would say really think about that. And then with that, investing in, again, continuing education. The certification is great because it becomes this forward-facing real piece of differentiation that you can provide to your community, local crisis centers, et cetera. Having them know that you're a local resource who's committed to these principles, not just checking a box and saying, I have general awareness.
Yeah. And as a member of the bar, we should be leaders in our communities regardless, and just carrying that banner forward as a profession that's supposed to be of excellence. There's a questions tab on the bottom right for everybody. The first question asked is, will this webinar be recorded and shared for those who are not able to attend? Yes, it'll automatically be distributed to everyone who signed up, even if they weren't able to attend. Also, I will respond to you individually with my email. You can also just Google it, or Dr. Laura Mcguire's as well. And we'd be happy to provide you a recording. That's, of course, that's no issue whatsoever. The more people who are listening, the better. We need to improve our space, continue to improve our space. So we'll wait for more questions to come in, and I have a few more if they don't, so we'll see. Dr. Mcguire, do you have any recommended reading?
Oh, yes. There's lots of good things to read out there. So I have a list that I provide to people who get the certification on just like not only books, but documentaries to watch, podcasts to listen to. I mean, there's so many great resources. I would say, I mean, some of the biggest ones that I would really start with are things like The Body Keeps Score, podcasts like Stuck Not Broken. Really, if this is, again, something you're either just getting into or you want to have more information around, but again, you're kind of figuring out what kind of investment you want to put into that kind of education, start with those kind of foundational pieces, right? And I think when you listen to podcasts like that or you're reading books like that, you'll start to have those same kind of light bulb moments of, yeah, this is really huge for me, and I'm maybe doing some of this stuff and I wasn't aware of it, or I could easily add that to my approach and that could probably make a huge difference. I mean, honestly, it's things as simple as reminding people to breathe, right? And that sounds silly, and I've had so many people in all these different spaces like kind of laugh when I say that at first, and then email or call me later and say, okay, I laughed when you said the breathing thing, but you know, I used it with a client when we were in between things and everyone was tense and everyone was stressed out. And I was like, maybe we should just take a few breaths. And the rest of the day went so much better, right? So it's all those little micro changes that add up to the macro. But yeah, start exposing yourself to more things in these different areas, and I think you'll start to see how much they apply.
If you're gonna recommend one thing to read, what would it be?
Well, I think I would start with The Body Keeps Score. I think it's kind of like the Bible for intro to trauma-informed care.
Okay.
And again, I think you can very much then get into some of the other books that are, you know, specific to different industries. But start with some of the classics, those foundational pieces, and really start to notice. I think the other big thing is this. So often we're looking for books or guides for, again, the external, like how to be forward facing in these regards. The first step is to do the work on yourself, right? You have to recognize, yeah, I get really, really upset and really triggered when people yell at me. Or, you know, I have a really hard time being empathetic 20 years into this industry. Or I think things don't bother me anymore because I don't really feel them on a surface level, but you know, I've been having a lot of health issues that I think could be stress related, right? So first you have to do that internal work. And then you start the building blocks of the other. And, you know, again, in our program, a lot of time we'll do a whole separate kind of section where we talk about things like spoon theory and understanding emotional energy currency and what are the resources that you have and how does that impact the kind of care you can provide. So yeah, start with getting some of those foundations and applying them to yourself.
And as I will personally attest, that work is never over, right? So that's kind of the fun part, I think, is that I look back on client interactions that I had as a young attorney and think, as a younger attorney, I should say, and I was thinking, I could have handled that better. Well, I'm sure I'm going to think the same way that I did in my morning call this morning 5 years from now, right? That constant improvement is a part of this, right? So we're right up at 2:30. We don't have any more questions coming in. I kind of want to just give you the floor for a couple minutes. If there's anything that I forgot to ask.
I think we covered all of the basics. You know, again, I love continuing this relationship with Milestone and your team. I would say, again, for folks who want more information about any of this, who want more recommended resources, again, maybe a specific area of law and they want to understand that experience in more depth, feel free to reach out to me. You can contact me through LinkedIn, Dr. Laura Mcguire, or my website, drlauramcguire.com, or equityandagency spelled out.com.
Great. Also, you can always reach out to Milestone if I feel very slappy. I don't have a screen right now with all the emails on it, but if you just Google Milestone Consulting or Milestone and Company, you'll find us. And just send us a message, shoot us an email, and we'll be able to find whatever answer you need. We're pretty much attached at the hip with Dr. Mcguire. Said before, thank you for so many things, including making sure that every day I go to work, I'm working around people who are also trauma informed, which is really exciting, knowing that we can make an impact in the world around us. It's exciting. Anyways, thank you for everyone who was able to attend, and we'll see everyone soon at the next half hour over the lunch hour with Milestone. Bye-bye.